Hi there, and welcome to today's webcast, How to Find C2 Activity with Zeek and MITRE ATT&CK. I'm John Gamble, Director of Product Marketing at Corelight, and we'll get started in just a minute. We're going to give people one more minute to dial in. Thanks. All right, welcome to today's webcast, How to Find C2 Activity with Zeek and MITRE ATT&CK. My name is John Gamble. I'm Director of Product Marketing here at Corelight, and I'm joined today by my colleague Vince Stoffer, Senior Director of Product Management. My personal background, I've been in the security industry for the better part of 10 plus years now, representing a range of products across identity verification, security, and privacy technologies. And Vince, his prior life was actually as an operator on the customer side. He's served a variety of security engineering and analyst roles at organizations like Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and Reed College. So in addition to being a really smart guy, Vince has practical knowledge of some of the things we're going to be talking about today because he used to be that analyst having to do these things for his network. So I'm pretty excited to hear what he has to say. Real quick, the agenda. We're going to try to do 30 minutes today. I think if you guys are like us, many of you have been working at home for the last 7 months plus, and you might have some Zoom fatigue. And we're going to try to make this a quick, fast, and tight webinar and get a lot of content in about a half-hour mark. So let's see if we can hit that. We'll start by covering the MITRE ATT&CK framework just to give everyone a baseline understanding of what that is and how we're going to apply it here. Then we'll dive into open source Zeek, again, provide kind of a baseline education for the audience about what Zeek is and how to use it. We'll quickly go to a word from today's sponsor, Corelight, just talking about how Corelight fits into the picture here. And then we'll get to the meat of today's presentation. We're actually going to go deep on 3 specific C2 discovery examples using Zeek data with MITRE ATT&CK, so putting together parts 1 and 2 with 3 practical examples. And lastly, we'll close with a question and answer session. So if you have a question, feel free to type it in your control panel at any time. We're going to hold questions until the end, but provided we have some time there at the end, we can get to your question. So with that, let's get started. MITRE ATT&CK. If you've been in the security industry, more than a year, you've probably heard this, framework mentioned, if not using it currently at your own organization. But it's a really powerful framework that documents adversarial behavior and very specifically documents it according to kind of technology or behavioral specific techniques and tactics. And the MITRE ATT&CK framework has a number of different matrices. There's the enterprise matrix, which we'll be looking at today through the lens of the C2 activities that we can discover with Zeek data, but also recognize that you can filter it by platform type. There's a Windows-specific matrix as well. There's also a mobile for specific matrix for mobile endpoints, and an emerging matrix as well for ICS, so industrial control systems. So the way to read this, if you've never seen this before, is from left to right. This is kind of ordered in terms of the sequence of attack, right? Security is all about chronology and reconstructing events if you're an investigator, or understanding a sequence of events in real time if you're a hunter. And the MITRE ATT&CK enterprise matrix is ordered left to right according to the approximate sequence of attack. So on the far left side, right, it starts with initial access. An adversary is actually kind of getting that first foothold in your environment. That might be with a phishing email, all the way to the end, right, where the damage has been done, the data has been exfiltrated, and the impact of kind of what's happened is final. And all along there's various steps, and these are how these are organized. And one thing to note here is that the first half of the matrix tends to be favorable for endpoint technologies and data, right? If you have a residence on endpoints like a PC, you're going to have great visibility on those endpoints into the things that are actually happening, the processes that are running on those endpoints. So you can catch things like a malicious process executing on that device. The back half, or the second half, if you will, of the matrix tends to be more network data and tool detection tool friendly in terms of discovery, because at that point, the adversary's gotten a foothold in the environment and they're starting to move and they're starting to communicate. And that's where the network excels, because you get that breadth of data, that visibility across your organization to detect those movements and to detect those communications. In some cases, they may be happening on devices where you don't have endpoint coverage. Now, that's not to say endpoints and network solutions can't cover both sides of this. They can. And as a defender, you probably want multiple layers of defense and opportunities to discover these activities in your environment. So you probably want to layer multiple technologies for any given adversarial technique to give yourself more than one shot at catching it. Now, today we're going to be diving deep on command and control, otherwise known as C2. It's a set of 16 techniques, 30 plus sub-techniques, and we'll break those out in a second, of various ways that attackers can communicate once they're inside your environment with their malicious servers, so they can send instructions into your environment and further move, exfiltrate data, basically program within your environment their next move. And they do that by communicating back out to servers that they control. And so that's the nature of command and control, right? It's all about communication. This isn't about data exfiltration. They haven't yet taken the data and taken it out of your environment. They've got that foothold in your environment, and now they're trying to expand and get ready for that kind of final few phases of the attack. And so if the nature of the game is communication, there's many different ways that adversaries can communicate with their C2 servers. MITRE ATT&CK here documents 38 different techniques and sub-techniques. I'll just call out two to give you concrete examples of what we're talking about here. So technique 1571 is non-standard port. So that's where an adversary is kind of doing a port protocol mismatch intentionally, because they're trying to bypass expected behavior and kind of configurations that you may have with your IT and security tools to either hide in noise or hide in an area of your network where you might not expect them to be talking. So that could be something like running encrypted, or rather actually trying to hide in port 443, but not actually running SSL through that port, doing some other custom protocol, using it and hiding in 443 because they think that you as a defender may have configured your network to ignore some of that traffic. Right? You assume it's encrypted, you assume you can't break and inspect it, therefore you're probably going to ignore it. Using that assumption, that might be an adversarial technique to communicate back out to their servers. Another great example here is web service, and a sub-technique under that is one-way communication. So that's technique 1102. That's where the adversary is basically taking advantage of the public web, right? Most organizations, unless you're in an extremely locked down, air-gapped environment, super, high level, clearance government spaces would be an example of that. Unless you're in that, you're probably not blocking the major parts of the public web in your enterprise organization. And that gives adversaries an opportunity to abuse those public web services and use them as a means to actually communicate once they've gotten inside your network. And Twitter, for example, is often used as a kind of means to deliver C2 commands, because organizations aren't blocking Twitter, and they can create a Twitter account that's actually tweeting out C2 commands. And a recent example we saw of that in the last year that was kind of interesting is the attackers even took it a step further, and they were tweeting out memes, images, right, with text kind of on the image, hard-coded as part of the image itself. Embedded within that image was actual further instructions, text instructions that were the actual C2 commands. So they took it even a step further. Sometimes people have caught C2s on Twitter that just look like strange alphanumeric garbage tweets. These folks went a step further and actually disguised it as a meme account, because the text commands from the adversary was embedded in the meme, in the image. So these are just two of the 38 different sub-technique examples that MITRE ATT&CK has documented for command and control. We're not going to cover the vast majority of them today, but we're going to go deep on 3, and we are going to show you very specific examples of how you can use network data from Zeek to actually find this sort of activity in your environment. So, all right, you've identified a TTP, a C2 TTP that you're interested in. You want to know, is this in my environment, right? Well, there's kind of two basic ways to do that, right? You could detect it, right, using technology. That's an algorithm, that's a rule, that's some piece of software, right, that has some sort of logic behind it that can actually detect and fire an alert on probable C2 activity that you're looking for. Great for scale and automation. Can be challenging if there's false positives and your high, a signal to noise ratio that becomes problematic, such that your analyst can't get to all the alerts. And detection technology isn't always perfect. It does miss things at some, point inevitably over a long enough time scale. And with that, you've lost your opportunity to retroactively go back and detect that again. So the other way, right, is finding, right? So if the left side is technology driven, the right side is human driven. Human analysts, security analysts, actually finding evidence of this C2 activity in their environment using data and making inferences from their queries, from their search, from their hypotheses about how adversaries might be abusing their network using data. So I mentioned earlier, right, that the second half of the MITRE ATT&CK framework tends to be more favorable for network detection solutions and data. C2 being in that second half of the attack matrix, right? It's a network data favorable exercise to find C2 activity using data. But what data are you going to use as an analyst, right? Well, if you're like many SOCs around the world today, you might be doing something that looks a little bit like this. And this is a very messy, kind of loud, noisy slide, but that's intentional because that's kind of the reality on the ground for a lot of security analysts today when it comes to network data for them to be able to hunt on, query against as part of their investigations. This is kind of the state of affairs, and it can be quite messy and quite painful. On the left-hand side, you've got a variety of physical appliances in your network or in a cloud infrastructure environment that are picking off logs, right? Logs that are specific to those servers and those protocols. And the thing about those logs is they were never designed for security folks in most cases. In most cases, they were designed for IT use cases. They were logs that were used, designed for troubleshooting, performance monitoring, configuration management, right, of those physical pieces of equipment in your environment or in a cloud environment. And it doesn't always have the data that security people need. And even if it doesn't necessarily talk well with the other data sets. And that's if you as a security person are lucky enough to have an IT organization that really enables you as a SOC to be able to aggregate all of this data sets into one place, like a SIEM, right? So even if you're lucky enough to get it all in one place, like a SIEM platform, now you're going to be playing a correlation game where you're going to be trying to piece together these disparate pieces of information, and that can be quite challenging. Timestamps might be misconfigured, and suddenly you can't correlate this log with that log easily. Logging may not have been enabled for a period of time. Maybe the IT team decided to turn it off because there was performance issues on the server, so you don't have data for a particular month. Those are just some of the common pain points that we find security analysts are having. And so, these are, I would say, less than ideal data sources to find C2 activity quickly as a human in real time on your network, because you're spending all of your time trying to do these painful correlations, trying to get the data in one place, working with the IT team, sometimes conflicting with the IT team to get that data, or you're collecting packets, and packets are great if you know exactly what you're looking for and where to look. But otherwise, it's kind of a boil the ocean approach, and you can spend hours as an analyst, tearing apart packets in Wireshark just to figure out a single question that you're trying to derive from those packets. So I would call this a less than ideal source of network data in the current kind of traditional instrumentation of these things. What if there was a different world? What if there was a single source of information about your network that produced data that was comprehensive, but also highly actionable in a format that was easy to store, easy to use, and specifically designed for security use cases? That would be great, right? There is such a solution out there, and it's called open source Zeek. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Vince just to talk a little bit about Zeek.
Hey everyone. Yeah, so open source Zeek is a fantastic project, right? It's an open source tool that's been around for more than 25 years. It really began as a way to explore the growth of the internet, and over time really developed into what is now the premier network security tool, and has really shown itself to be more valuable than so many other combined tools. Like John said, when you have the ability to see all the network data together in a kind of single uniform way, and then manipulate those events and that data to get what you want out of it, you can have a comprehensive view to be able to, as an analyst, answer all of the sort of questions that you usually struggle with during incident response. So it's the gold standard for network evidence. It's really it's part of many SANS training courses. It's part of Cisco certification. It's accepted and used by most of the major vendors in the security space. And it's got a huge open source community around it, right? So at the highest level, how does Zeek work? It's basically doing full deep packet inspection, running a bunch of different protocol analyzers on the traffic, and then creating events from the things that are seen on the wire. And from those events, it basically distills down into different outputs. One of the outputs is the Zeek logs, and these are the standard logs that come out of open source Zeek that most analysts are familiar with working with. And of course, these logs can be customized, they can be changed, they can be expanded and extended. But the default logs that come out are really security relevant and all about the security context that you need to do the incident response and the threat hunting that we're talking about. You can also with Zeek extract files, so carve files right off the wire and then send them off for further analysis. And one of the most powerful parts of Zeek is that it includes a domain-specific language, a scripting language called Zeek Script, that can take those network events and combine them together in many different unique ways to create detections, to extend and expand the data. Like I said, you can make new logs, you can put logs together, and also to interface with other tools. So pulling data in and augmenting the data from the network or from Zeek, and also sending data out and connecting with other systems to do response, to do integration, and really to just extend that system. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how Zeek is traditionally deployed. So it's notable that it's always out of band, and it basically requires kind of some technology on both above and below it. So you need to have, some sort of network tap, a span port or a packet broker to feed the raw traffic into Zeek. And then once it does its analysis and creates those logs or those detections, those alerts or those extracted files, those go out somewhere else. So you can think of it as just an engine that's creating this data, manipulating the network traffic into more useful data and then sending that out. And so you can see, it's easy to integrate with many SIM products and analytics tools, tool chains, data lakes, etc. And then, easy to send those extracted files off to other file analysis tools. Worth mentioning that, of course, you can also integrate data, like I mentioned, threat intel, as well as kind of structured data that might be related to information around your organization, whitelists, blacklists, CMDB information, all that stuff can be pulled into Zeek and then used to augment the detections and the data there. And so that's what you get, right? Take traffic in, do stuff with it, and produce high quality output. If we go to the next slide, this is kind of example of these are the summaries of what some of these Zeek logs look like. And you'll see they're organized by protocol. So you've got an HTTP log, a DNS log, a files log, etc. The con log is the connection log, which is kind of the high level connection. And so what's really amazing about this data is it has all of these interlinked fields. There's a unique identifier that ties together each individual connection and shows not only the metadata about the connection, but then each additional protocol that is used in that connection is linked together, and those logs are all written out so that you as an analyst don't have to do a lot of that hard correlation work that John was talking about. You'll have timestamps that are tied together. You'll have this unique identifier to tie all the logs together that you need, and you'll be able to do the searches and the pivoting that you can do in your sim or even on the command line super easily. And so when I started using Zeek, I think it was amazing just to have the power of all this data at my fingertips as an analyst. And I think if you have used Zeek, you'll agree, or if you haven't, you'll find when you finally get to look at this data, it's amazing to have everything available to you and be able to answer the questions that you have, which is oftentimes as an analyst, you have questions that you want answered. And instead of struggling to find the right data to do that with, you can just think of more questions, think of deeper questions, and think of how you can expand your exploration or investigation to really finalize and answer all the questions you have. And here's a quick example of just a single log. Here's a DNS log. You can see on the bottom, a typical kind of DNS query log has just a few bits of information. And at the top, you'll see the Zeek log has everything from the timestamp, the unique identifier we talked about, you know, every single flag that's part of the DNS record. It has the request and the responses. So you see the purple fields there for all the responses and the TTLs for those records. So you've got a whole bunch of information. I want to keep moving because we've got a lot more to talk about in terms of these examples, but I'll hand it back to John to talk about Corelight.
Thanks, Vince. Real quick, just a word from today's sponsor. Who is Corelight and how do we fit into this picture? We offer an open network detection response platform, open in part because it's built on open source technologies, Zeek being a foundational technology of our platform, and we also recently announced support for Suricata in our platform as well. And this basically allows security teams to make fast sense of their network traffic at scale using these great, powerful open source technologies of Zeek and Suricata to provide that signal and evidence to be able to quickly kind of resolve incidents, but also kind of discover new incidents and also threat hunt with the right data at the right time. Now, how do we deliver this? We have a range of sensors that are very easy compared to some of the open source implementations at scale to be able to get up and running in your environment, whether that's a physical network, we've got a range of appliances, or a cloud environment, if you're using AWS, we can deploy this technology into your network traffic, and you can get that real-time insight and the data that Vince was mentioning right at your fingertips in your favorite SIM, so you can start doing the queries that you want to do to find activity like C2 traffic. So with that, let's dive into 3 specific examples of how to find C2 techniques documented in the MITRE ATT&CK framework with Zeek data. Vince, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So let's start out with one that we mentioned before, non-standard port usage. So this is the case. You can see the technique is 1571, and this is where a attacker might be using a well-known protocol, like let's say something like HTTP or DNS or something like that, over a non-standard port. So instead of using port 80 or port 53, they'd be using something that's either completely random or trying to obfuscate or hide their communication. Why is this really a problem? Well, if you're using proxies or other network monitoring, which is dependent solely on port numbers, that's not using some kind of deeper protocol inspection, they're likely not going to find this. So they're just going to ignore this traffic. They're not going to see it. And adversaries may be able to communicate then without detection. So the example that we're going to use here is from the connection log. So again, this is the log that shows the high level kind of metadata for every connection on your network. And basically what we've done here is say, hey, take a look within the connection log for all the connections on my network, look for just HTTP, and the service field in Zeek is actually identifying that the HTTP protocol analyzer has connected to this connection and found that it is HTTP. So we're doing dynamic protocol inspection or detection. And this is not just, again, based on a port. This is said, hey, I'm running an analyzer on this, and this appears to be legitimate HTTP traffic. So I'm saying, look for HTTP traffic. And look for it when it doesn't have a typical, destination port of 80 or 8080 or 443 in this case. So we've just kind of taken all the HTTP traffic, whitelisted away a bunch of, normal standard ports that it might be running over, and then said, show us what's left, right? Sorted those by count. And then you see in the left column here of the table, we see the different response ports and then the counts of how many connections we have for each of those on the right. pretty straightforward example, but again, you've got all of this data already in your SIM if you're using Corelight or Zeek, and so now we can just start exploring that data a little more. So I scrolled down, I didn't take the top one, I just took a different example. I said, okay, port 8000. Well, that's one that you know, might be commonly used. It's kind of just a couple extra zeros after an 80. It's one that might be used for, you know, proxies or other tools, but let's examine it. We do have 54 connections here that are using port 8000. So let's dig in a little more into one of those. So here's an example of the connection log. This is actually kind of a reduced version of the log, but we're seeing all the fields now that would be that you'd have for every single connection on your network. And what you see is the response port of 8000, like I mentioned. You see a whole bunch of other information about this particular connection. You see the 5 tuple, you see how much traffic was transferred, you see, you know, MAC addresses associated with it, everything else. And at the bottom, you have this connection UID. And as I mentioned, that's the unique identifier that ties together this connection with any of the other logs. So now if I pivot through and say, okay, well, it looks like this was HTTP, we know that, and we've got a little more information about the connection, but what else could I find out? So if I take that unique ID, you see now here down at the bottom, there's that same unique ID. We've pivoted over to search, and we've found now a different log file, this time the HTTP file. So this is coming from the HTTP protocol analyzer in Zeek and writing out into the HTTP log. And now we have a whole bunch of protocol specific information about this connection over HTTP. And a few other interesting things have popped up here now, right? We see that there's actually a post, and so that's what's going out to port 8000 is a post. We see the post body here, URL encoded. Don't quite know what it is by looking at this right here, right? But I also see a couple file identifiers for the files that were transferred, in this case probably just the text of this post body. And so if I wanted to actually go and dig in, because this is just a subset of the post body there, what can fit into the log, you know, this could be a rather large piece of text that was posted. I could then take this unique identifier for the file and go and check out an extracted file that was carved off the wire and go dig and take a look and see exactly what this was. But what is interesting is, you know, this could absolutely be command control that's posting some sort of information about the system it's been installed on, or some sort of commands that are being executed or responses from those commands out to this server on port 8000. And now with just a couple quick searches, we've managed to go from show me all the traffic that's HTTP not on standard ports, dig into a couple examples, and now we can start finding specific things that might be worthy of a little more investigation. Again, this is the data-based approach, so we're not actually detecting something necessarily malicious, but what we are detecting is something unusual and giving us the ability to go and dig further into a specific example of something that might be wrong. Cool, so that was one example. Let's do another one. Here's an encrypted channel. So this is 1573. The problem is adversaries can use encrypted channels to communicate. It makes it a lot harder to see if we're just depending on unencrypted visibility, if we're detecting using just signatures and expecting that we'll be able to see all of the activity over the wire. Then adversaries may be able to communicate or get lost in the noise of all the encrypted traffic, and there's not much, you know, traditionally that network monitoring tools would be able to do. So in this case, we're going to use a couple other logs, the SSH log and the SSL log. And if we jump into this SSL log example, what we have here is all of the SSL communication, TLS communication, is going to be analyzed by you know, by Zeek, and it's going to actually write out a couple different logs. The SSL log is kind of the high-level connection information about the TLS or SSL connection, and then there's an X509 log which has more certificate-based information. So what we see here, though, is information about you know, the certificate that was being used. So we see the issuer, we see the subject, we see the validation status of the cert, etc. We've also added in JA3, which is a fingerprinting technology used for client and server. That was developed by the guys at Salesforce, and it's a pretty commonly used way to at least get an idea of what a specific client is using in terms of its potential options for how the negotiation for TLS happened, and that gives a fingerprint that we can go back and search for. So I've identified just with this single log a few strange things about this particular connection we're looking at. Well, it's got kind of an example.com issuer, it's got a self-signed cert, so it looks like something that kind of came out of either a framework or out of just kind of a default install of some sort of piece of software. Again, not necessarily malicious, but by digging into just some anomalies or unusual activity around encrypted connections, we could start digging in and examine these, looking for instance, anything that's running outdated, versions of TLS, like TLS 1.0 in this example, or looking for anything that's generating or using self-signed certificates. If we dig in a little more, Corelight has actually released something that's only available to our customers called the encrypted traffic collection. And this is based specifically on just analysis of encrypted traffic. So there's no decryption, there's no break and inspect to get these inferences, but we're watching SSH and SSL traffic and then generating a whole bunch of information about what could potentially be happening over those connections. Again, just based on the statistical and other analysis of these connections, the encrypted connections. So what you see on the left is an example of all the sorts of different things that we can identify for SSH. And one specific example, keystrokes, is actually looking for interactivity. So looking for typing over an encrypted SSH connection. And so that could definitely indicate, adversarial activity, could also indicate just the sysadmin logging into his server. But if you start taking, for instance, just the keystrokes inferences, looking in all your SSH connections, and then, whitelist off the folks that should be accessing your servers, you might be left with a pretty small list of people that are typing and interacting with particular hosts on your network, but aren't known to you. So an example of how that can be used. The second example, I think, is, let's see, in the SSL log, we also have a couple inferences that are used here. One is called custom crypto, and so this just means that essentially we're seeing a connection that does not use the traditional TLS negotiation. So we would normally see an unencrypted handshake and capabilities exchange for TLS, and then an encrypted session would begin. If we're seeing this custom crypto, it means we already see a pre-shared key, or we see some sort of other unusual negotiation that's not using an unencrypted, beginning to that session, and that's quite unusual. So we'd flag that, and that would give you an idea of also some places to start looking. Lastly, this encrypted traffic collection does contain a bunch of information about certificates, like we talked about. So there's some of the inferences that you can see for, new certificates, outdated certificates, invalid certs, etc. So more inferences, and these might not, again, be security related per se. They might be more operational, but you'd be amazed how oftentimes an attacker is going to take the easy way and look for, using a set of tools or a tool chain or something that's, using self-signed certificates or out-of-date certs, etc. So this might be a tell that would give you something to dig into a little further.
Thanks, Vince. Our third and final example here, finding CTO activity via protocol tunneling. So this is MITRE ATT&CK technique 1572, protocol tunneling. And the specific example I'm going to use here is around DNS tunneling. So DNS is an incredibly kind of noisy, voluminous part of your network, and therefore adversaries love to tunnel inside of DNS traffic to hide, communications, sometimes even data exfiltration. But particularly for C2, it can be quite an effective protocol to use because it's so noisy and so voluminous that in many cases you're not going to see it. You're not going to see the forest for the trees, or you're going to be possibly not deeply inspecting this, right? A lot of firewalls will allow DNS traffic to bypass so it doesn't interfere with business operations, things like that. And so the problem, right, is DNS servers typically aren't capturing the data you need to actually see some of that tunneling activity. You're not getting the full query and response of the DNS event, which you would need to be able to see if an adversary might be doing something fishy, like using it as a C2 channel. And the data we'll use today is the Zeek connection log and the Zeek DNS log. So real quick here, this is kind of very similar to the first example Vince gave. We're going to take the aperture of our environment, and we're going to start very wide, and we're going to narrow in. And so what you're seeing here is we're starting with a query where we're basically looking for DNS queries where the query character count exceeds 25 characters. Why 25 characters? Well, most DNS queries are typically human-driven queries that are kind of plain text, hey, google.com, right? I want the return for that, right? It's not typically an alphanumeric string of human nonsense, but if it is, that might be interesting because while that could be benign, it could be something like an ad network calling out. It might also be somebody up to no good on the network trying to push kind of commands through the DNS protocol by packing them into these DNS queries. So let's just start with that hypothesis. And now we filtered down, and we've also sorted here by count, just like Vince did on his first example. And we immediately see here a particular IP address here that is extremely chatty. We're talking about thousands of records here. And so we're going to pivot. We're going to take that UID, that connection ID that links all of the Zeek logs together, so you can track a connection across port and protocol. And we're going to pivot on that unique connection ID, and we're going to say, all right, now I actually want to see what's happening here with these queries. I actually want to see the queries themselves that are exceeding 25 character in length, and we can see them here down here at the bottom, and we can see that they kind of don't make a lot of sense to humans, and that they are part of a sweetcoldwater.com domain. And so, don't recognize that name. These character strings are certainly potentially an issue. Again, could be benign, could be an ad network, but it's worth digging in further. So let's pivot again. Let's actually now pivot and look at the responses to those queries and see what's being sent back in response to those DNS requests. Well, we've got more strangely kind of alphanumeric encoded strings coming back from that domain. Something's odd here. Maybe I did some quick Googling. Sweetcoldwater.com isn't returning anything that looks legitimate. I'm going to pivot again on that UID, and I want to actually kind of look at the scope of these connections in totality, and particularly here, how big, how much data is passing through in this environment with these particular connections. And we can see that a lot of data is being passed through here in this DNS kind of activity. We may have a smoking gun here that is worthy of further investigation to get to the bottom of this. This could well be, C2 communications over DNS. And so just like Vince's first example, we started big and narrowed in. Here we've taken a hypothesis about where someone might be tunneling for C2 activity and DNS traffic, and we've narrowed down to something that looks certainly worthy of deeper investigation and is potentially a malicious C2 communicating over DNS. So with that, we'll flip over to Q&A. Let me just pull up my control panel here. 1 second. All right. Oh boy, we've got a number of questions, and we went up about 3 or 4 minutes over the 30-minute mark we set for ourselves. So let's take maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then I can follow up with people who ask questions that we didn't have time to get to. So let's see here. Let's see, with automating the carving files of the wire, how do you deal with privacy concerns or carving and storing confidential documents? Great question. So I'll give one answer, and Vince, if you've got a second to add. There's a high level of filterability because Zeek is open and because Corelight supports Zeek. You can actually control at a very specific level what data you do or do not collect because it's open source. So there's a high degree of file filterability, especially in Corelight system. So you can easily filter out certain file types, and you could also create custom rules or kind of, basically rules of certain file extraction events that you would not want to collect on based on maybe IP ranges, for example. Vince, do you have anything to add to that?
No, the only other thing is just, generally, right, network traffic monitoring needs to be done within the kind of legal and policy framework. So oftentimes some of the data you'd be collecting just in general off the wire, even without carving files, might, fall under, the same sort of concerns about PII or sensitive information or whatever. So I think it's just worth, in the context of how this data would be used, right, it should be used within, a security team and within that sort of framework that is established for a company.
Great. All right, one more question before we close the line here. In example 1, Vince, that was your first example. What would you use to decode the post body content to see what was posted in something readable?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I didn't dig into that one. I just took it from some example data we had. I think it's just URL encoded, so that would be straightforward to just go ahead and punch into any, kind of URL decode tool. You could do it online or whatever. If it was something that was actually more obfuscated, that it had, a cipher or some sort of hash applied to it, there are techniques that you can use, and there are some tools you can use to kind of try to pick those apart. But at the same time, often I think you'd find, or you will find, that attackers are using, again, the path of least resistance. So they're not bothering to use encryption. They're not bothering to really obfuscate much about that communication. And in that first example, maybe all we need to do is go look at the file and, URL decode it, and we'd see all of the commands that we're passing over.
Great. Well, with that, I'm going to call time. We promised to keep it shorter than average. In these times when we're all on Zooms and webinars, we want to make valuable use of your time. For those of you whose questions we didn't get to answer, I have your email addresses. I will follow up with you. This is being recorded, so you will have the opportunity to share this with colleagues or rewatch it if you like. And lastly, just a quick offer I'll make to the audience. It's been quite popular on webinars. If you want to email me, my email's up there, john@corelight.com. A really great way to learn how to do some of these queries that Vincent and I were showing you here is to come play one of our virtual capture the flags games. We do it a couple times a month. It's free to join. It takes about an hour. We give out great prizes. There's a soundtrack. There's technical support on hand to help guide you through the queries. So even if you've never used Zeek and you're not, a particularly, experienced analyst, and you want to get to learn to know Zeek and how to do these queries that you saw in today's presentation, a really great way to do that that's actually pretty fun is to come play our virtual CTF games. So just shoot me a quick email, john@corelight.com, and I'll send you an invitation to one of those next CTF games you can play. With that, I'm going to call it a wrap. Vince, thank you so much for joining us today, and to the audience, thank you for tuning in. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.